black-owned businesses, 7 billiard parlors, a taxi service along water in Maine, and things were really thriving until economic depression hit the United States in the mid-1890s, and it affected Wichita profoundly, as it did the whole country. In the decade of the 1910s, in other words, exactly 100 years ago, the decade we're in now is the 2010s. 100 years ago, segregation laws were passed all across the United States, including Kansas. Those laws were being protested by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which founded its Wichita branch in, I believe, 1917. And what I put on here are, you can't read them, but they're letters, protests. It's a letter protesting the new segregation laws, and coming from a petition of people involved with the local NAACP. And I don't know if you can read it, but this is just before World War I, and the signature here is Colonel Jesse Brown, someone who had served in the Spanish-American War, probably served in the Philippine-American War, and now we're signing this petition saying, I'm a veteran, we're veterans, we've fought, and many of our family died for this country, and now we're getting these segregation laws passed. In the 1930s, the state, during the Great Depression, again passed another law. Municipal and state public works projects were prohibited from discriminating for racial, religious, or ethnic reasons in their hiring. That's a pretty important law, but again, it was not enforced. So despite two anti-discrimination laws on the books, discrimination was the Kansas way. These laws were not enforced. Please remember that, because we'll get a little bit later, we'll get to looking at what happens 30 years later and what is different 30 years later. So what about the schools? You remember all those little red dots on the map, all those cities? Well, state law allowed Kansas towns, actually I should have put cities. A city was 2,800 people, not like our cities today. Cities could decide for themselves whether they wanted to operate segregated schools. If you're a really small city and you have 1 or 2 black families in your community, you're not going to have segregated schools. That would be ridiculous. Why would you spend that kind of money, no matter how how much race hate or desire for separation you might have. So the towns that did vote to do this, like Wichita, actually implemented theirs in 1912. I misspoke, it wasn't 1917, 1912. And separate schools were established in Wichita according to race. That would last for 40 years legally. It would last for 60 years in fact. What about public places? Well, there was only one park that had a swimming pool, one park that admitted African Americans. McKinley Park, which is now called McAdam Park. No swimming pools did, even though if you were Native American, Asian American, Mexican American, you could swim in the swimming pools. So this is a very specific discrimination targeted only at African Americans. There was a suit in 1953, and that changed things. The suit was brought by Chester Lewis, and you'll see him in just a few minutes. By the way, Lawrence, Kansas did not open its pools to African Americans until 1969. Imagine that. Hospitals, the YMCA, the YWCA were segregated. Public eateries were, restaurants were segregated, etc. In fact, there's a study that was done, designated by the city to do a study of race relations in Wichita in 1947. And it reported that separate schools for blacks and whites through the 8th grade were taught by, black schools were taught by Negro teachers who only could teach in those schools. And this was typical of larger Kansas cities. Kansas City even segregated the high schools. A black veteran who was wounded in World War II sent letters to the governor protesting this kind of behavior. And he's from Ellis, Kansas, and in 1944 he wrote, he said he's complaining that when he goes into cafes, there are signs posted on the counters that say, "We cater to white trade only." And again, he's saying, I fought for this country. You know, I and other veterans would have dedicated our service for this country, and this is the treatment we're getting. By the 1950s, the black population of Wichita had doubled, and also Southern whites had moved into Kansas to get work. And residential segregation, in other words, by practice, keeping people into a particular neighborhood and not really allowing them to move out of that neighborhood because of their race. Residential segregation increased. Wichita was a 95.3% segregated city in the 1950s. There was only movie theaters with balconies or black-owned restaurants or hotels allowed African Americans to use their facilities. In Topeka in 1953, black teachers' contracts to teach for the next year were canceled. You know why? Because the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education suit, which was actually 5 suits, working their way through up to the Supreme Court for a decision, the school board in Topeka felt, and this is a quote, the reason given was that in the event segregated schools were no longer possible, the board did not feel that a majority of the white parents in Topeka would willingly have their children taught in classes conducted by Negro teachers. The Wichita School Board ended legal segregation of schools by law, right, in 1952. By the way, I interviewed the one white woman on the school board who, along with an African American on the school board, had pushed very hard for desegregation of the schools. Her name was Edwana Collins. I interviewed her daughter about a month ago and learned from her daughter that she got death threats, she was harassed. Her papers are at Abla Library at WSU, so if you have any interest, you can go and see Edwana Collins' papers, which includes a thick file of all the harassment she received for supporting desegregation of schools. The policy changed to neighborhood schools, and as long as you kept neighborhoods segregated, that meant segregated schools. Understand? Okay, so in fact, segregation continued. In law, or de jure, segregated schools did not continue. Got the difference? 1954 and 1955, the Supreme Court made 2 decisions about school segregation. It was President Eisenhower's administration, and the person who was the head of the Supreme Court was a person who had incarcerated the Japanese in California, had overseen the incarceration of Japanese, Earl Warren. When he got to the Supreme Court, he said, I had a different perspective. I saw, as head of the Supreme Court, as Chief Justice, that I needed to be thinking about the good of the country way beyond this present moment. And so he got all of the justices to agree with him, all of them, all 9 justices, that segregating kids in schools was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Imagine that. He wanted a unanimous verdict because he knew it was going to be controversial and he didn't want it challenged again. The federal courts will enforce this with all deliberate speed, was the decision a year later when the second Brown decision came. All deliberate speed is a real confusing statement. All deliberate speed, deliberate means carefully, slowly. Speed means fast. So there's a whole lot of wiggle room in there, in those words. It would also be enforced by the local federal judges who live in the community, which means that if a local judge enforces with too much speed for the happiness of the people who live in that town, he gets run out of town. And that did happen with Justice Wadey in South Carolina. So for nearly 20 years, from 1952 to 1971, despite the Supreme Court's ruling the Wichita School Board maintained segregated K through 8th grade schools by redrawing the school district lines to correspond to racial segregation. Okay? De facto segregation. Almost 20 years. So I mentioned Chester Lewis before. Chester Lewis was the leader of was probably the primary leader of Wichita's civil rights movement, although there were many, 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 many people involved. He moved to Wichita after KU Law School. He had grown up in Hutchinson, which was too small a city. The city fathers decided to segregate their schools, so he went to integrated schools. At KU did admit African Americans, but it segregated them in the cafeteria, excluded them from intercollegiate sports, orchestra, excluded them from white sororities and fraternities until the 1970s, and accepted ads that were racially discriminatory in the KU newspaper up until 1965. But nevertheless, he had been at the top of his class, graduated from KU Law, was an activist, and had served with the United States Army of Occupation in Okinawa, Japan. There he is in his uniform, looking very young, with his family. He's the one that's circled. And at age 24, Lewis brought the first anti-discrimination suit in Wichita's history. He sued over the segregated swimming pool, and he won. He went to the hospital to see his new baby and found out that his new baby was put in separate bassinets at the back because she was quote unquote black. And he threatened to sue the hospital, and they changed their policy on the spot, not wanting a successful lawyer at the top of his class at KU Law to be suing them. So he won. He used that 1874 law that had not been enforced, and he used his credentials, Chester I. Lewis, Jr., attorney, right, which is always a little threatening when we get a letter from an attorney, right, to open up the airport cafes, to get through the NAACP, which he became head of, to get the police to do training in race relations. Now think about this. This is the 1950s. The police had the NAACP doing training in race relations. Boeing, the biggest employer in Wichita at that time, had 400 black employees out of 30,000. But all of them were in unskilled jobs, even though they had been trained, many of them had been trained to build aircraft. Lewis's complaint resulted in the promotion and training of 65 people. Now that's a small number, but it's significant, right? So what's happening at the national level? Well, President Eisenhower enforced the desegregation of the military that President Truman had ordered in 1948. President Eisenhower also enforced the Supreme Court's Brown decision by sending in federal troops, the 101st Airborne, to Little Rock, Arkansas, when 9 honor students, high school honor students, tried to attend Central High School and were met with mobs and threats of lynching, etc. This was the first time that federal troops were sent into the South to enforce the Constitution in 80 years. In 80 years. Here in Wichita, there was a spin-off group that was part of the YWCA, a group of women calling themselves the CCSA, led by Anna Jane Michener and Annabelle Haupt and Esther Brown and Danielle Grubbs and others, many others. Black and white women decided to go together to visit restaurants, and they would go in teams. One team would be a black team, one would be a white team, and they would watch to see how they were treated. And if the white women were seated and served, and the black women were made to wait for service, then they would talk to the man. They would ask to speak with the manager, and they would say, "We don't like this. This is unconstitutional. It is not the way we should be operating." They were amazing. They eventually also started flying all over the state of Kansas. I think this is a great strategy, bringing what they called panels of American women into remote, rural areas of Kansas to hold conversations about what is it like to be me? What's it like to be me? And they had You know, in those days, Catholics and Protestants were, it wasn't Islam and Christianity, it was Catholics and Protestants, right, that had huge differences of opinion and distrust for each other. So they always had not just a black woman, but also a Catholic woman, a Jewish woman, a Protestant woman, etc. I put this up because you all know the story of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old boy who was terribly mutilated and murdered in Mississippi in 1955, and whose story became like national news. And if you were alive at that time and you were African American, you never forgot the story of Emmett Till. You never forgot where you were when you heard it, because it made you realize how dangerous it was to be in your skin. Some of these young people were very upset about the fact that their aunts and their mothers and their fathers, if they worked downtown in Wichita, which was a pretty vibrant area, they could not be served at the chain stores along the side, the places like Grant's, Kresge's, right, and Dockham's, which had 9 stores in Wichita. And they talked about what they might do to try to change that. This is the picture of the 2 leaders, Ron Walters on your left, and Carol Parks Hahn, who is still here in Wichita, the 3rd person to your right. And then between them is the NAACP youth director, and at the end is Mrs. Rosie Hughes, who still is living at the corner of Grove and 13th, right? 13th? Amazing woman who was their advisor. They wanted to do a sit-in. They had read about sit-ins that had been used by the labor movement, where you would, they called them sit-downs, where you would just sit down and say, we're not leaving the plant until these conditions of our treatment are improved. And they had met with a couple people who were familiar with those sit-downs. So they asked the local NAACP, and Carol's mother called Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the national NAACP, to say, our students want to do a sit-in at the Dock and Drug Store downtown. And Roy Wilkins told them, no, that's not a tactic we want to use. The NAACP is being persecuted. It's banned in 5 southern states. If we go to that kind of confrontation, we're going to be in even worse trouble. Please, you may not do a sit-in. But the local NAACP, after great discussion, said, we want to support our youth. We will give them support for this sit-in. Chester Lewis agreed to be their pro bono attorney, and they would go against the national veto, against the national veto of the sit-ins. So there were 30 to 40 young people, ages 15 to 22, who organized. They met in church basements and in people's homes to plan how they would conduct the sit-in. They were determined to sit in on Thursday nights, which was the only night the stores were open, and on Saturdays. And in July of 1958, they began the sit-in. There were 2 groups, a college group and a high school group, that joined together. Students had individually tried to get change through sitting in, individually or in small groups in the past, in 1952 and 1956 at least. But what was different about this is that it was sustained. It was kept up for 3 weeks. And it would have gone on longer. When they were about to to start doing the sit-in every day of the week, during the week, when it finally was successful. But in 1958, this was a sustained, practiced, planned student sit-in, and it became the first successful student-led sit-in in the country. After 3 weeks, they convened a community meeting, and at that meeting, the youth spoke, and they told the worried adults that what they were doing, why they were doing it, and they asked for adult support. And the assembled group decided to expand the sit-ins, like I said, to every day of the week, Monday through Saturday. The stores were not open on Sunday. Here's the only picture that I have found of this sit-in. It appeared in the Enlightener newspaper. If you get the Community Voice, which I advise you to do, it's a wonderful newspaper here in town. The Enlightener was the community voice of that day, a newspaper that particularly told news of the African American community, some beyond that, but especially the African American community. There's a much longer story to this sit-in, and some of you are probably familiar with it. There's also been a documentary film that KPTS regularly shows that they made about this sit-in, so I'm not going to give you more details. Suffice it to say, on August 11th, the manager came out from the back of the Dockham store at the corner of Broadway and Douglas, and he said to his staff, "Serve them. I'm losing too much money." Carol Parks called Chester Lewis, she called her mother, and she called the other students to report the news. They had been successful at desegregating that Dockham store. Dockham's was part of the Rexall drugstore chain. You all remember Rexall? There still are Rexalls. I saw some in Selma. It was the largest drugstore franchise in Kansas. It had per capita, if you figure this difference in population today versus the 50s, in the late 50s, there were more Rexall drugstores per capita than there are McDonald's today. So it's a huge chain, right? Chester Lewis calls up the head of Dawkins and says, "Is this just one store you're desegregating?" You know, with always that little implied, "I'm a lawyer, you know, I can make this so difficult if you say no, if you say yes." And then Dawkins management said, I guess we're desegregating all 9 stores here in Wichita. He said, "What about stores in the Rexall drugstores in Kansas?" I guess we're desegregating Rexall drugstores in Kansas. There is some evidence, it's in the documentary film, it's not my research, but someone else's research, that it actually worked throughout the country, that Rexall throughout the country desegregated their lunch counters. Chester wrote to the National NAACP to tell them that this sit-in that was done against their advice was successful. Martin Luther King talked about the sit-in in 1960, talked about this sit-in here, and then in 1963, in letters from the Birmingham jail, said, "One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing out for what was best in America, in the American dream, and for the most sacred values of our Judeo-Christian heritage, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence." I just want you to remember that even though this is a tremendous success story of the Dockham sit-in, it doesn't end segregation in public places. For 5 more years, people are protesting and sitting in at the other stores, Grant's, at Kresge's, Woolworth, etc. And there is success. There is a state law, we'll see that in just a second, and it will eventually in 1964 be a federal law. But it takes incredible tenacity and stick-to-itiveness to keep up this protest. So why isn't it better known? Well, the National NAACP was not very happy that its order not to do this was disregarded by the branch. And a few weeks later, in Oklahoma City, the students started a sit-in, just quite soon after ours. And that sit-in raised the membership of the Oklahoma NAACP youth group by 2,000. The kids came out, like we've been seeing, if you've been watching the media and the protests that have been going on in the last, 2 months? You've seen a lot of young people just coming out, right? And that's what happened with the Oklahoma City sit-ins. And the upshot of it was that the Oklahoma City had on the national board someone from Oklahoma City who was able to say, look, if you ban sit-ins, you're going to see that we're going to lose a lot of interest in our organization, and we need to kind of pick up on this momentum that the sit-ins are bringing. Several years ago, the National NAACP did recognize the Wichita sit-in as the first successful student-led sit-in. The National Park Service and the Smithsonian were latecomers, but they now do recognize the Wichita sit-in. In the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History, our sit-in is mentioned, and that picture you saw of Carol Parks Hahn and Ron Walters, it supposedly is poster-sized in the area that's talking about just before the Civil Rights Movement. They still give Greensboro in the Civil Rights Movement area of this display, but we're up there in the 50s area, section of the museum. I already said this, that Martin Luther King did acknowledge the success of the Wichita sit-in. This is what the NAACP director of branches said in 1960. He said, the NAACP Youth Council in Wichita, Kansas in the summer of 1958 sat down at the Dockham drugstore and desegregated the lunch counter. As a result, integration of lunch counters took place elsewhere throughout the state of Kansas and spread to Oklahoma City, Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, blah, 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 etc. Here are pictures of some of the people who participated in that sit-in at when Kathleen Sebelius was governor. The NAACP honored them, and you'll see Todd Tehart and Kathleen Sebelius in the picture with many of those who were involved sitting in. In the 1960s then, state laws still permitted segregation in the schools, and state laws banned segregation in public accommodations, but that ban was not enforced. State employment agencies, this was something that really blew me away when I first found the original primary source documents. The state employment agency in the 60s was still advertising whites or blacks, right? Of course, they're also advertising women or men, right? Blacks were employed only in menial jobs, and you can always find one or two exceptions, but for the most part, and not allowed to rent or to buy in new housing developments. In 1963, Chester Lewis and his wife Vashti moved into a white neighborhood north of WSU that fall. A cross was burned in their yard. Neighbors protested their presence, their cat was poisoned, a rock crashed through the front window, and Unitarian Universalist church that they attended and belonged to supplied volunteers to walk in front of their house and try to protect them from other violence in the neighborhood against them. There was a victory in 1963 at the state level, Kansas Public Accommodations Law, which made it a misdemeanor to discriminate in hotels, motels, cabins, camps, and restaurants. And it was enforced. You could be fined up to $500 or be given up to 1 year in jail. Enforcement is critical. To have a law without enforcement does not do much good, if any good. 63 is also the year that Kennedy is assassinated. Kennedy had, that fall, that November 22nd, Kennedy had called for a Civil Rights Act, a national Civil Rights Act to ban discrimination. And the March on Washington, where we think of the I Have a Dream speech, was done to try to bring people out in support of that Kennedy proposal for a Civil Rights Act. People came to Washington, they marched, and then they went up on Capitol Hill and met with their legislators. 250,000 African Americans. But, I'm sorry, I should have gone back a minute. But when Kennedy was assassinated, well, at that moment, some people connected his assassination with the fact he was becoming such a strong supporter. Lyndon Johnson, who became president, since he had been vice president, Lyndon Johnson said, one of my first acts is going to be to call on national civil rights leaders to come to the White House, meet with me, and let's strategize how to get this bill through. That was very significant. Johnson was a Southerner from Texas, but he was committed on the civil rights issue, partly because he'd spent a number of years teaching in a rural school in East Texas, mostly Mexican-American kids, but he saw what poverty did in kids' lives and how discrimination made for poverty, contributed to poverty. So Johnson was able to get this memorial to the slain president passed in 1964. It banned discrimination for race, religion, gender, national origin, all of those were banned. It became a federal offense. Education, public accommodations, and employment. You could not discriminate. The law said federal money would be withdrawn from people who violated that act. Now, what's the word I want you to be thinking? What does that do? What's enforcement, right? Federal dollars, which were going into cities for highway construction, for federal aid to schools, for model cities programs, for war on poverty programs, federal money would be withdrawn if you discriminated. The federal government was really going to be serious about enforcing this law. By the way, why is gender in there? Anybody know? That's pretty progressive for 1964 to say you can't discriminate because someone's a woman. It's in there because, did somebody know?
Poison pill?
Yeah, they tried to kill the bill. A congressman from Virginia added gender, thinking that no one in their right minds would vote to say you can't discriminate against women. And Lyndon Johnson was visited by two women who were members of Congress, and they said to him, you know, you have 2 daughters. We want you to fight to keep this provision in there and to get the bill passed with it. And he did. The following year, 1965, the issue that had not been addressed in the Civil Rights Act of '64 was addressed by public protest in Alabama, with people going to Alabama, marching from Selma to Montgomery, the capital, to try to give public visibility to the fact that you could not vote, even though the 15th Amendment of the Constitution says that no state shall prohibit a person from voting, a citizen from voting, because of their race, their color, their previous condition of servitude. Right? It's in the Constitution. Go online and you'll see it. So for 3 months, people were marching from January through March. There were people from Kansas who joined them because Dr. King saw how violent it was in Alabama, and he called for support, backup support from clergy around the country. And they came, and college students came too, students from Winfield and Bethel College and Newton, and clergy. There were martyrs of the civil rights movement. There were many martyrs. In Mississippi alone, there were more than 30 people who were killed because of their civil rights activity. There were also, and those were African Americans, there were also European Americans who died in the civil rights movement. One of them was a Wichita-born man who was raised in Russell, Kansas, a minister of a Unitarian church, James Reeb. 560 people attended his memorial service. He went to Selma, marched at Selma, and was a group of white supremacist guys caught him coming out of a cafe and beat him so severely that he died a few days later. So we have our own martyr in the Mississippi movement. President Johnson had been asked to support a Voting Rights Act, and he'd been afraid that maybe the Civil Rights Act of '64 had kind of burned people out on civil rights, so maybe he needed to wait a little bit before he approached the issue of voting rights. But the Selma March, 3 months of people going and marching and marching and marching. Remember, 3 months. And the violence against them. And the television stations covering what was going on in Mississippi. The media telling what was happening in what otherwise would have been invisible to most Americans. Changed the tenor of feeling across the country. And he came out in support of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it was passed. I put up something here that brings this more current, because I think it's important for us to realize it. In 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States invalidated part of the Voting Rights Act. There was a part of the act said that if there's a history of keeping people from voting in a certain area, then the federal government has the right to oversee the elections, to be sure that they're free and fair. Do you understand what I'm saying? If there's a history of discrimination in voting, the federal government has the right to go in. And that was invalidated. Since then, several states have redrawn state lines, boundary lines for, not state lines, boundary lines for congressional districts to try to disenfranchise African Americans. It's happened in quite a few places, actually. It's a very scary thing. And if you saw yesterday's paper, you saw that Kansas has the strictest laws on voting rights and keeps people out of voting more than any other state. It's a pretty phenomenal thing. Look up the article in yesterday's paper. A group is now, I believe, suing on that.
And Kobach has 2 bills before the legislature.
Yes.
That are going to further disenfranchise up to 18,000 voters in Kansas.
Let me repeat that. Secretary Kobach has 2 bills going through the legislature now, are in the legislature now, that would disenfranchise about 18,000 more Kansans, take the right to vote away from 18,000 more Kansans. And that's in the paper also, the story from yesterday. Okay. Chester Lewis was the president of the local NAACP, the Wichita NAACP. And Mathewson Junior High School, which was a fairly new school in northeast Wichita, had been built and was half black and half white in student body population in 1958. What happens is the school board is asked by a group of white parents to redraw the boundary lines to assign the white children who lived west of Hillside to go to Brooks. Yeah, to go to Brooks. And so that Mathewson would immediately become a black junior high school. Now again, not by law, but by redrawing the boundary lines, de facto segregation. Everybody clear? Okay. Mathewson to the NAACP was a great opportunity to sort of gradually begin desegregating Wichita schools. If they could desegregate Mathewson, then Mathewson was really the only junior high school. Today we call them middle schools, but it's a slightly different structure than the junior highs. Junior highs would go through 8th grade. If they could desegregate Mathewson, keep Mathewson an integrated school, then that would be like the first step toward desegregating Wichita schools. It was the only junior high school, so then you'd be down to just the elementaries that were segregated. Okay? So, but white parents, I think I've got this confused. I mean, I think I've got, there were 2 issues around the schools, when Brooks was built and when Coleman was built. And so the white parents went to a meeting, black parents submitted hundreds and hundreds of signatures on petitions, and the school board ended up listening to the white parents, refused to agreed to draw the boundary lines so that the students, white students who had been assigned to Mathewson were now not assigned to Mathewson, they were assigned to white junior high schools. Okay. What happens as a result of this is Chester Lewis is really frustrated. He's done lots of research on the schools in Wichita. He has 300 pages of documentation showing that the schools that have the largest number of portable classrooms are in northeast Wichita, in the black neighborhood, the predominantly black neighborhood. He has gathered all of his data. He sees the school board year after year. I used to have all the maps, and I was amazed because it was almost every year they would redraw the boundary lines, and it was completely in keeping with residential populations. And so he gets in his plane, he's a pilot, he flies his plane to Washington, D.C., goes to the Civil Rights Office of the federal government and submits a complaint against the Wichita schools for violating the 14th Amendment. And for 4 years, the school system negotiates with the federal government about this. And the federal government keeps saying, you've got to address this, or we'll take federal money away from you. And they will the school board makes small steps, like they will allow parents to request to send their child to another school that is outside of the neighborhood schools in Northeast. But you have to get special permission, and you have to provide your own transportation. Right? So it means your chance to really be fully participatory is really very seriously limited. So 10 years into the modern civil rights movement, just to do some comparison, in Lawrence, in 1963, 9 years after the Brown decision, 40 black young adults were rejected for clerking jobs in downtown Lawrence. And 4% in 1964, 4% of black dwellings had no indoor water, 8% had no indoor toilet. In Wichita, 65% of Wichita's non-whites held unskilled jobs. Only 9% of the white population held unskilled jobs, but 65% of the black population. In other words, hiring was not non-discriminatory, right? The city was hiring African Americans for unskilled jobs only, and the state was still advertising for unskilled jobs, specifically for blacks. But things were changing. In 1967, at East High School, Oscar Jones was elected homecoming queen, right? Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you. Homecoming king. Oh, it's embarrassing. Oscar would have my head for that. In 1965, East High finally chose its first African American cheerleader. Now, remember that the teams have numbers of African Americans playing on the sports teams, guys, but no women had been chosen to cheer. 1965, Anita Williams is chosen, and that's this picture of her. You see her in the back. But then the next 2 years, they didn't put any African Americans on the cheer squad. So they thought, it looked like this was changing, but then for 66 and 67, no African American cheerleaders. In 67 and 68, by the time you get to 67 and 68, you're 13, 14 years after the Brown decision. Now think about kids who grow up in schools. Think about somebody who's in first grade in 1954. By this time, this seems like your whole life. Things have been supposed to change. Discrimination is supposed to be a thing of the past. And in fact, it's still hanging on very, very hard. And so there's a lot of frustration in the country. In 67 and 68, here in Wichita, there were episodes of police mistreatment. By the way, the training by the NAACP had stopped, of police officers had stopped. And there were episodes of the police harassing young people. And that would then spark somebody throwing a rock, and then the newspaper would cover it as bombing happening in Northeast, riots happening in Northeast. And if you actually go and look at research, the amount of damage done was way exaggerated by the press. Okay, there was a fight at Sandy's Diner across from East High. That was a violent fight. And when there were no African Americans included on the cheer squad once again in 1967 when they got that news. There were curfews, and they did something very creative. The city police force, working with the NAACP, decided to deputize young African American men, certain young African American men, to be their own sort of, what's the word, like interns and helpers. They were the Northeast Patrol. They would be able to keep the peace in their neighborhoods. It was a brilliant idea, and it lasted for about a year and went pretty well. We did through the Kansas African American Museum, we did a documentary film of the late 60s last year, and I interviewed a bunch of people for that. I wanted to just share with you a couple of the quotes. These are prominent people in Wichita today, black people who experienced this time. One of them, who had been sent to Heights High School, where she was one of almost no people of color, said, "I felt so invisible. We wanted to be seen. All we wanted was to be acknowledged as human beings." Another white 1967 graduate of East High said that the counselors, the vocational counselors, brought him into their office and said, "Oh, you want to go to KU? Even though you're a D student, no problem, you plan to go to KU. And then his colleague, who was a straight A student, was sent into the counselor, and the counselor said, vocational. That was it. The coaches at East High used a quota system for how many African Americans they would have playing on their team. And two of their star athletes, Oscar Jones and Eddie Thomas, were told they could not play their senior year, one on the football team, one on the basketball team, because they had to be careful not to have too many blacks starting. And so instead of being able to get that scholarship to go on to college, the athletic scholarship, they were not allowed to play. They had to sit out. But they were brought in and told, we'll find you a scholarship to Friends or Newman or someplace like that. We'll get you a scholarship if you don't make a fuss about this. No history or literature classes reflected African Americans' contributions to the United States. And this was a time when nationally things were really pretty in a lot of turmoil. Most teachers would not make eye contact or call on me when I had my hand up, one of the people we interviewed said. By 68, when white-black backlash was really beginning to surge, and black frustration was beginning to surge following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, whites working for desegregation were receiving death threats and threatening phone calls. In addition to Juana Collins, school administrators, the new superintendent of schools, Alvin Morris, who was determined that the school board would go the direction the federal government was telling it must go. And his assistant, Dean Stuckey, both told me when I interviewed them that they had to have guards around their house. There was so much white hate that was acted out, and they were getting so many threats. Young black men who were protesting the Black Lives Matter movement of that time were expelled from East High, were fined $2,500. If you check online, $2,500 in 1968 money would have the same buying power as $17,804 today. Think about that for a minute. Think about a high school kid. Some of the people we interviewed last year said, you know, some of my buddies were picked up and put in prison and given these enormous fines, and it changed their lives. They couldn't go to college. There was no, you know, they had been on a trajectory of going on to school, getting a higher education, and it just ended. Remember that in 1968, Richard Nixon won the presidency, and this is where we can look at some parallels here I think that are important. He got only 43.4% of the vote. Neither candidate, neither major party candidate, Hubert Humphrey or Richard Nixon, got a majority. He won by 500,000 votes, 500,000 votes, right? He campaigned on law and order. He was challenged in the Republican Party by an Alabama segregationist, George Wallace. He implemented an FBI program of spying on Americans who were dissenters, those who had been involved in the peace movement or in the civil rights movement, determined to show that they were communist-inspired. At the end of the years of that COINTELPRO program, J. Edgar Hoover acknowledged that there was no evidence that the communists inspired these protesters. And in 1972, when Richard Nixon ran for his second term, he explicitly adopted a Southern strategy so that he could attract white supremacists to support him. And I'm not telling you this from my own research. There's just tons of material from scholars who have researched this, and you can read about Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. He also instructed the IRS to audit people on his enemies list. White backlash, by the way, cycles in American history. It's not a new phenomenon today. But it happened after the end of Reconstruction. It happened in the 1920s when the Klan was reborn, 1910s and early 20s when the Klan was reborn, and it happened after 1968, and it's happening again. It happened in the 80s. Okay, we're just about done. Last slide, I think. From the 1968 Nixon campaign, I wanted to share with you these quotes from what Nixon said, because I think they may have some resonance for you. We need a new respect for law in this country, a new determination that when a man disobeys the law, he pays the penalty for his crimes. Some of our courts have gone too far, weakening the peace forces of this country as against the criminal forces. and we must restore the balance. And another statement, another campaign statement, Nixon said, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators, those are the folks we speak for. They're not racists or sick. And I read a couple days ago that President Trump's chief advisor during his campaign, Manafort, was quoted in a couple of articles in July as saying that last July that the 1968 Nixon campaign was the model that they were using for running this campaign. This is important. Federal government notifies the city it's in violation of the 14th Amendment. It must desegregate. It will pull back the money from Wichita, and the decision is finally made to desegregate the schools in August of 1971, 5 years after Chester Lewis has filed his complaint. But they will desegregate the schools by busing black children out of their neighborhood, not busing all children. Not setting the schools the way that had been recommended by the committee set up to make a recommendation to the school board, by making kind of campuses where you would bring kids from different neighborhoods together so they would actually grow up going to school together. This desegregation plan ended in 2008, and of Wichita's schools, 85 schools, 1/4 of them have a racial concentration of 60% or more of one group, one ethnic group. So the agreement in 2008, when they dropped the desegregation plan here in Wichita, was that no school would have more than 40% black, more than 55% white. We're in violation of that now.